Hey, I'm Peter, and welcome to my podcast, Waking from the Fire. I'm excited to have Amanda Fairbanks with me today. I'm going to read to you her bio, and then we're going to start talking. Amanda Fairbanks is a journalist and author of The Lost Boys of Montauk, the true story of the windblown 4 men who vanished at sea and the survivors they left behind. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Boston Globe, the Atlantic, the San Francisco Chronicle, the Columbia Journalism Review, and the East Hampton Star. A graduate of Smith College and a former Teach for America Corps member, she has 2 master's degrees from Columbia University's Graduate School of Journalism. The California native lives with her family in Sag Harbor. Amanda, welcome to the show.
Hi, Peter. It's so lovely to be here. What a pleasure. Thank you for making the time and for your interest, most of all.
My fans know this, my audience members. I loved your book from the moment I read it. I think I ran across it while I was in Sag Harbor on a visit, and I couldn't put it down. I don't know. It helped, I guess, that I was on the beach reading your book, and it was local, and it is a tragic story. But what I want to get into in a few minutes after you give us some background about the book and how you came to write it. I want to talk about something you touched on, which was family dysfunction, that I just think you did an incredible job of doing for us. So thanks for doing that.
Yeah.
So tell us about The Lost Boys.
Thank you so much. So this was really, it was a labor of love. And way back in the winter of 2016, I was working as a staff writer at the East Hampton Star. And about 6 months later, I would leave that job, although I didn't quite know it at the time. And one of my a new editor who had joined the staff, who's now become a friend, his name is Biddle Duke. He's in the book mentioned a little bit. And he and I were just sort of riffing on story ideas between a journalist and an editor and kind of becoming acquainted with one another when he told me just kind of the beginning first layer that there was this, kind of incredible untold story of this area and history. And obviously it was about these 4 young men who died at sea, who were lost at sea. And, the incident had taken place in 1984. And there was this kind of huge class component of this working class and the blue-blooded families sort of colliding aboard this boat. And during the same conversation, he started talking to me quite a bit about Mary Stedman, who is the widow of the young captain. And he just kept going on and on about Mary. And I said, well, obviously the story has struck a nerve, much more so than anything we've discussed. And, why is it that you don't want to write it? He had a long history here. He grew up in Southampton, spending his summers here. And he said, well, I've often thought of writing it myself. And to be honest, I'm just too much of an insider to this story. Is that your dog in the background?
No, it's not. I don't know what that was.
Sorry. I don't know what that was.
Okay, it sounded like a dog ran across the set.
It sounded like my dog wagging its tail. Got it. So he, so we're going on and on. He said, it really requires an outsider to come into the story who isn't wedded to a particular version of the narrative, who can really kind of see it with fresh eyes, who, doesn't have long-standing ties here and isn't, worried about alienating some people, because there's certainly some sharp edges in this story. And anyway, a year and a half would go by. I moved then to Northern California for 2 years. My husband had a midlife crisis. That can be another podcast.
Sure, he and I can trade crises.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah, exactly. I think it's always a sign of personal growth and learning about yourself and accepting change. So we were in Northern California, and there was just something about this story and Mary that I just couldn't quite let go of. And when we were back here the following summer, which would have been the summer of 2017, is when I started interviewing Mary and beginning sort of the early stages of my reporting. And when I sold the book in the winter of 2018, I really sold it on kind of the first layer of what I thought the story was. And of course, it was about these 4 young men lost at sea. And certainly Mary was one of the main characters. But, it really wasn't until I began, my deep dive into this that I discovered just all these layers hidden below the surface. And, to be quite honest with you, although I didn't know it at the time, at the start of this long journey, I think I wasn't interested. I don't want to say I wasn't interested. The story about the fishing obviously is a piece of the story. And I think some readers want to pick up The Perfect Storm and reread that amazing book. But as you know, most of the drama of this book unfolds on land. And I think the whole time I was much more interested in obviously who these men were and how they collided aboard this boat. But much more so, the particular psychology of fathers and sons, what that dynamic is like, and how it is that this trauma had really wedded itself inside the lives and minds of so many of just the survivors, the women who were left behind, and certainly how it was that this tragedy would course through the next generation. And of course, we get to know a bit about the father's eldest son, Chris, who I grew quite close to during the reporting and writing process. And just one last thing, and then I'll hand it over to you, obviously. This is just a much different type of writing and reporting that I normally do for newspapers. I get to know these people over months and years at a time. And as you know, we reveal ourselves in these layers, and often, we don't necessarily reveal the most vulnerable parts of ourselves until we really get to know someone. So there was certainly a give and take with that. And, sometimes it wasn't until my 10th conversation in with someone where I feel like they finally kind of let get down their guard. I share a bit about my backstory, and it's definitely a sort of give and take. And it's my dad actually just finally finished reading it after all this time, and he was like, God, it was such a sad book. And it was sad, and it was a lot. It was very heavy living with all of those conversations around grief and loss over and over and over again. And I certainly related to that on so many levels. So I'm so pleased that it resonated with you, and that you got some of those really important themes that I think were undergirding the process all along, although I didn't necessarily know it at the start.
So that was going to be my question to you. Did you set out just to tell this story? And I do want you to give us some background about what actually happened to the 4 boys on sea, lost at sea. But it sounds like you didn't expect, maybe with Mr. Biddle, you had some background that there might be more layers of the onion, as we say, to this story, but you didn't really, I guess you couldn't know how deep it really went. And I love the contrast between the blue bloods, we'll call them, and the locals and these 4 families. Something I loved about it, Amanda, is you shared both sides, these very wealthy, privileged people, and some of them that worked. I'm not saying that they were just handed something, but they worked to get to where they were. And then some of the local folks that were blue collar people, and that no matter where they were in the socioeconomic stratus, they suffered some of the same fates or some of the same struggles, which I found so fascinating. And I always love to connect with other people, not to know that they're suffering or struggling like I have, but to know that I'm not the only one doing so. So thanks for sharing that about yourself too. I appreciate that.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I think it's, when we get to the heart of things and get past the kind of cocktail party conversation, I think we have a lot of this universality that we're sharing as humans that is often unspoken. And certainly we all have different experience of that and different levels of that. And we've all processed that in different ways. But that was certainly, so living here year round, and as a writer here, I'm endlessly fascinated by this class divide that we have, right? It's this playground for the rich and famous part of the year. And then it's this place where normal people live, kind of the rest of the year. And there's obviously a huge population, a service economy that builds houses and cleans houses and kind of allows this other population to have this life, right? This lavish existence. And what was so interesting about this story was that through the lens of David Connick, who, was born and raised in a Upper East Side penthouse, and his parents were members of the Maidstone Club, that very early on, he felt that was sort of this hollow, shallow existence. And unlike his father, he didn't want to go to Yale Law School and, have this corporate job. That there was something about the sea as a surfer, just as with his friend, Captain Stedman, that really captivated him. And there was a truth in the hard work, and there was a real camaraderie and a brotherhood. And it was so interesting to see how, even though there was this huge disparity between wealth and socioeconomic status, that this had this sort of shattering effect across the board. It didn't matter how many sort of resources you could throw at grief. It was equally devastating in different ways for the different folks left behind to kind of make sense
Yeah,
of this. Yeah.
absolutely. And I definitely want to touch on
Sorry, the
that. But
light here is really weird, right? I have like
oh,
sunlight
that's
coming
better.
in.
Hold on, you just had it.
Is that better? Is
Yes, much
that
better.
better? Okay. Okay.
Thanks. I thought
Sorry,
that
the
was
light
just
is
my
shifting.
screen.
Yeah,
That's
no.
okay.
Okay.
That's okay. We heard what you said, and that was all compelling. So we're going to get to that because I really want to talk about David and his mother Alice, especially
Yeah.
Chris. And that last chapter, I have to tell you, that last chapter summed up family trauma and brought it to you. You added some healing in there too, which was so beautiful. You know, one of my favorite authors is Eric Larson, Devil in the White City, a lot of best-selling books, and I love him because he writes nonfiction like fiction.
Mhm.
And that's how you wrote. That's how I read it. Like I knew this was a true story. I knew there was a sadness, but I was also so compelled to learn about these people and then hear more and more deeper layers.
Mm,
So um,
thank you. Eric
you're
Larson
welcome.
is a beautiful writer. Yeah.
So yeah, he's great. But so and he goes deep too, but you went even deeper and you had these
Mm,
deep conversations with folks and they revealed a lot to you and some of them
yeah.
got pissed off. I know that you did alienate some and I want to talk about that and what that was like being um at I can't remember Bobby Van's and
Oh
having this
yeah. Yeah.
exchange.
Yeah.
But give us a background of the story, please. What happened to these four boys?
So the main sort of dramatic tension, if you have it, obviously I write nonfiction, so there's not a sentence in the book that I made up. But so the main kind of dramatic tension here is that these four young men, Captain Mike Stedman was 32, Dave Connick was 23, Michael Vigilant was 19, and Scott Clark was 18. So these four young men were longlining for golden tilefish. It was March of 1984. They would do generally, 5 days on, 2 days off, 5 days on, 2 days off. They would go way out into the canyons, hundreds of miles off the shore of Montauk. And it was just the golden era of tile fishing. They would come back, 5 days later with tens of thousands of pounds of tilefish. This was a brand new boat, a very, very troubled boat that Captain Stedman had recently invested in. And I want to loop back around to kind of his decision making and Chris's recent sort of version of what may or may not have been happening with his father at the time. But so they were caught in this sort of unforecasted hurricane, and they were out a week at sea, and the weather really suddenly shifted overnight. Everyone in the fleet, made it back just in the nick of time. There was a Mayday alert. There was a capsized vessel. They couldn't make it into the inlet in Montauk. There was just too much water everywhere. And for whatever reason, they stayed out the longest. And early in that morning, they were just 12 miles off the shore of Montauk Point, where the lighthouse sits. And that was their last radio contact. There was never a Mayday call. There were 100-mile per hour winds and sea swells of probably 40 to 50 feet. And they were in a little 65-foot fishing boat with a wooden pilot house, and not a huge ocean liner, what have you. And that was it. They vanished. And the pieces of the boat were recovered during the search and rescue, and but the bodies were never recovered, and the vessel was never recovered. And I think the lack of closure in this story was another layer of trauma. I think as humans, we need that body to process the loss of a beloved, and none
Right.
of the survivors in the story had that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so one thing I will never stop thinking about. So I went into this thinking I would come to know all four of them equally, right? That was my goal when I began this, of course. And Scott Clark, who was the youngest crew member, and had grown up with a single mom and or much closer to the city on Long Island, in Oceanside, Long Island. He was very new here. He was a young kid. He had dropped out of high school, and his mom had passed away. His father was never in the picture. And by the time I got around to him, there weren't a whole lot of people that could help connect the dots for me. And his mother, actually, Donna, went to her grave believing that her son was still alive, that she had sort of conjured up the story that he, had hit his head and had shown up on Bermuda, and she worked for TWA Airlines, and she had these airline miles that she would use whenever she had a vacation to go and travel to South America and the Caribbean and all over the world, putting up missing signs for her son. And this kind of magical thinking and, I think sort of inability to reconcile this loss was definitely a common theme that many of the survivors shared. Certainly Michael Stedman's three young sons.
Yeah, and it's hard enough, like you're saying, with trauma, especially if someone passes tragically or quickly. If you have the body, you can have a process there, and still we walk away from those events carrying a lot of that stuff. My father,
of course,
he was, we had a burial for him. We saw his body, and I still walked away and carried for longer than that, 40 something years, all of these emotions, and he was right there. So I can't imagine someone that never sees, like for Chris, the son of Captain Stedman, to never have seen his father again. He was 9 when his father went out.
9, yes.
9.
And his younger brothers were 7 and 3.
And you wrote so beautifully about Chris and his father, Mike, being inseparable. And you wrote about them going to the beach and fishing and surfing. And it was just this beautiful story. I'm getting emotional thinking about it.
Yeah.
And then he's gone.
Really beautiful
he's just
bond.
Gone. Yeah. And then I
interviewed over 100 people, and during the process, there was not one person that said an ill word of Michael Stedman. I mean, he was just a really charismatic, magnanimous, just wonderful guy that I just was, the whole time dying to get to know and meet, obviously, in real life. And he was just this mythical, figure, especially for his eldest son, who remembers him the best. And his sort of golden years of his childhood until he was suddenly taken away from him. And I think that's tricky, obviously, for so many reasons. It's not like his father was suffering long illness and they knew the end was coming, which is another type of, grief and loss. But this just hit everyone so suddenly and unexpectedly in all of the prime of their lives.
Yeah. And Chris,
so tragic.
That scene that you wrote about where Chris is standing on his driveway, and I forget the family friend who comes up the driveway and says, your dad's gone, you're the man of the house now.
I know.
So
at 9 years old.
What does that do to Chris, right?
Yeah.
At 9.
Yeah. And it's a heavy burden to carry.
Right.
And his mom, as we know, would have all sorts of difficulties in the years following. And he really was the man of the house and had to take on that, insane responsibility of his mother and his 2 brothers, and while also grieving the loss of his father, and certainly not being able to be a man of the house at 9 years old.
Absolutely not being able to grieve. We'll talk about that if we have time, because there's so many tangents.
Yeah, of course.
But let me tell me, can you share with my audience, some of us are aspiring writers, some of us are writers, what's your writing process like? You decide on the book, or you decide on the story, I'll say, and then you start doing research. Do you start interviewing people? What's your process?
So just this morning, actually, I just finally sold my next book, which I'm excited about.
Congratulations.
So, thank you. It's been really actually quite challenging. And not that you think you write one book and you wave a magic wand and someone gives you another book contract, but it was a humbling process yet again. So I think people see writers and books and it's like, oh, this must just be so easy. And there's a lot of rejection and difficulty behind it. It's a long road.
So you're telling us don't give up. Right?
What did you say?
You're telling us don't give up.
Don't give up. Absolutely do not give up. You cannot give up. And yes, you just absolutely have to realize how much rejection is involved in the process. And I'm so happy I didn't become an actor or something like that and have to be dealing with this, all the time, every day, because I just try and sell a book every so often.
Can you share with us your new book?
So it's going to be based here on Long Island. The main narrative is going to take place on Gardiner's Island, and that's about all I can say at the moment. Okay. And similar to Lost Boys, I was just having this conversation with my new editor. I don't know exactly what the story is yet. I've just done kind of like that first, I've just like peered beneath the surface, just a teensy little bit. And he has to kind of have faith in me, and I have to have faith in myself that this process will unearth a whole different version of the story than I think I know now. And so with the work I do, for nonfiction, I, just start pulling up, all of the newspaper stories that were ever written about something I'm working on, magazine stories. And then I start reaching out to so many different people to try and fill in their version of what had happened. And often I ask, if there's different people that are difficult to access, I ask for someone to kind of hand me off to them, hopefully, and kind of figure out a way to get them to talk with me. And of course, not everyone wants to, and that's completely fine. And so that's sort of how the process works. And an old journalism teacher of mine would always say that you should stop reporting once you know what the person is going to tell you, that you know the story well enough that it's like there's a certain point in which you just have to stop accumulating information. Right. And with this book, since it was my first book, I was kind of throwing paint at the wall, and I didn't know, how much about golden tilefish I needed to learn, and how much about grief and loss I needed to become an expert in, and the psychology around that, and fathers and sons, and all these different dynamics. And so this time, what I feel really great about is just even in this beginning process, I'm already starting to kind of outline where in my brain this is going to go. Whereas the first time I just had this, boxes and boxes of material and hundreds of thousands of interview notes to try and make sense of. And that was quite overwhelming, to be honest.
Yeah, I was just going to ask. It sounds, I'm overwhelmed just thinking about it. I wrote my memoir, and my memoir came out as from journaling from a 12-step program. I had no intention. Someone actually said, I think my middle daughter actually said to me, "Dad, why don't you just write a memoir at this point?" I was like, "Are you crazy? You know how much work that is to remember everything and to chronicle it?" It gave me anxiety attack just thinking about it. And here I am, 4 years later, and I have this. Wonderful. So would you say to be a good writer, you have to be a good reader?
I think you definitely have to be a good reader. I think you have to, really immerse yourself in, if you're writing a memoir. I love memoirs. I just absolutely love reading memoirs. So I personally don't read, I read some fiction. I don't read a ton of fiction. I'd say I read mostly memoirs and nonfiction, and a whole array of topics. But for instance, when I was doing this book, behind me, I'll quickly tilt my camera, is just, like two shelves full of books related to the world of the sea, and all of those sorts of things. And I'm not going to do another sea-based story, or shipwrecks from the 18th century or anything like that. I like interviewing living people. Getting into history I love, but I'm certainly not a historian or anything like that. So that's sort of my process. And then I don't really start writing until I've done the bulk of that reporting and research. And then, of course, in this book, in Lost Boys, it ended very, very differently, the first draft. And it really wasn't until Chris, kind of, as I was mentioning, brought me along and brought me in, that I felt like I could end it in a hopeful way. And that didn't happen for a while. And I was really weighed down by leaving the reader in this sort of sad, desperate, hopeless place. And not wanting to do that I felt like there was a bit of light in the story. And again, it wasn't really until Chris brought me along through that process that I could explain that to the reader.
Yeah, that like I said, that last chapter is
just read the last chapter.
Yeah, don't skip to the last chapter. But if someone just read that last chapter, I believe they would get something out of it, because there's so much post-traumatic stress and healing. And Chris is just this guy, this beautiful guy. It sounds like, I feel like I know him, that's trying to just be better.
Yeah. And I think I'm just so in awe of his vulnerability and courage. And obviously I'm a complete outsider to him, and his faith in me, to tell the story of his family and his father. I'll for just forever be in awe of. Truly, it's such an honor to do the work that I get to do. Yeah.
So let's dive into some of the interesting characters that are real people. I forget that sometimes. Mary Stedman. Talked about her. She almost sounded like an enigma, like this powerful force that affected the people around her. Tell us about Mary.
So Mary is an enigma. Gosh, she was 29 years old, a mother of 3 young boys when her husband was lost at sea, her first husband. And this just rewired her whole brain and her whole life. And she actually had been a child of pretty severe trauma herself, and alcoholism, and just sort of this emotional neglect, I would say. And, Mary just has this incredible intellect and a photographic memory, and is one of those people that was sort of born in this tricky time where, she didn't have kind of a role model pushing her in maybe a different direction. And I could have easily seen her doing so many other things with her life. Not that it's not a wonderful thing to become a mother, but she did that, she got married when she was 19, which is very, very young. And she kind of hadn't lived out, enough of her life, I think, before experiencing that. So she is tricky.
Yeah. So
And we began the story by becoming very close, obviously, for about a year and a half. And then Chris, actually, in our first conversation, he asks me, has Mary told you, the secret in the story? And I said, well, I've been talking to your mother for 18 months, and she shared with me all sorts of things that I'll never talk to you about or anyone else about, that are off the record. And that was when, Chris revealed to me sort of another layer of the story, and this question of paternity, right, and fathers and sons, and who belongs to who. And that obviously, not only did it complicate my relationship with Mary, we eventually grew estranged because of that she felt like things had just gotten out of control. And that I was out to write one particular type of book, which I can completely understand her perspective on that.
Sure.
That it was kind of a break in trust between the writer and the source. And again, I left out a whole bunch of stuff in this book that I could have put in.
I know there's another book here about, I wanted to talk about process again real quick. So did you find out about what Chris's secret was, or what this family secret was, before you got to that point in the book? And did you just hold on to that and then reveal it as those chapters unfolded?
No, so I didn't wait to start writing until I knew about that. But I really weighed whether or not to include that in the book. Do I include it? Do I leave it out? I knew by including it, I would alienate and anger all sorts of different people that were connected to the story. And indeed, I did. I certainly did. And I live here, right? So that's another complicated aspect to it.
Right. And you ran into one of the characters, I know, and were not treated very nicely, I guess, or just.
Yeah. It's tricky doing the work that I do. One of them threatened to sue me. Mary wrote me a note shortly after it came out that I wrote an essay about, she called me the great exploiter, which was difficult to process, and felt, I'm a very sensitive person. And so that was difficult. I didn't set out to write a book that would please everyone. And early in the process, I realized whatever I wrote about, let's say, Mary, even a physical description of her, she would find, there would be aspects of it that she would find problematic. And one of the more illuminating conversations I had when I was, again, at this juncture of what do I include? How much do I include? I was getting a coffee with one of the girlfriends of the young Stedman sons who had dated him in high school at East Hampton High School. And she said, oh, well, if you don't put it in, this quote unquote secret, everyone who actually knows the story will think you don't know what you're talking about. And you never actually got the truth of the story. Because everyone who knew these boys in this particular time in East Hampton, which was then a very small year-round community, knew what had occurred. So that gave me, I think, a different sense of freedom with it, that I wasn't exposing this kind of state secret that had never been uttered before. That it was the fullness of the story, and that it had ultimately to do with the theme of my book, right? Which is loss, and fathers and sons, and how we make sense of our identities, and how this particular incident, and then the layers behind, is this person my father? Is that person my father? How that changed the process for the survivors. So it's not like it was the secret that had nothing to do with the core of my book. Right. And then I probably wouldn't have included it, right? Because it wouldn't have made sense.
No, clearly when I read it, it wasn't about sensationalism. It was about yet another layer, and explained some of the behaviors of some of these people that were struggling. That, I say that respectfully.
Of course, of
Um,
course. And I have
so
so much empathy for them, and I tried
yeah,
to write it from that perspective. And obviously
same
not everyone had that takeaway. Yeah,
same here. And I look, I'm talking to you about these people are still alive, most of these people, and
of
you can
course.
run into Mary tomorrow, and I don't. I feel for them. I'm captivated by the story. I'm so interested in them, and I hope that they're okay. And I think us talking about this might help someone else. So I think there's a benefit there
I think so
that
too.
we
Yeah.
can't sweep all this stuff under the rug. Eventually, that rug is just going to be this pile that we trip over in every aspect of our lives.
Right. And I
You
think I think for Chris, just one last point is that
sure?
I think for a long time, had felt like he was living under this cloak of secrets and that the truth would really set him free. Not that it needed to necessarily be expressed in the form of a book, but that there was a clearing of that, that energy, that darkness, that withholding. And it would just the revelation of it would ultimately be healing. And obviously we I don't know that to be the case, but it's certainly been of benefit to him and
Right.
intense to process.
Yeah.
When you start reliving the most traumatic thing that ever happened to you and talking to a journalist about it for hours and hours at a time, it's re-traumatizing
Yeah.
for a lot of the people in the story, which I didn't know at the outset either. That
Sure.
it would be so triggering, which makes
Yeah.
complete sense. Yeah.
Yeah. But I'm sure with that, bringing it up, opening up those wounds, it's an opportunity to heal those wounds or to look at those wounds and say, what are they really? And Chris did that in that when you shared in the last chapter. But I want to talk about fathers and sons because you brought that up a couple of times, and it's a
Hmm.
key element of this. A lot of the reasons why some of these young men or boys went out to sea. Tell us about Mike Stedman's relationship with his father, Bruce, I think his name was.
Yes, Bruce Stedman. So yes, the fathers. I'm not intimating that these four guys were out in the middle of the Atlantic catching tilefish and talking about their father issues. And again, when I set out to write the story, I had no idea that they would have so much in common. But they all had fathers who were of this kind of particular generation, who were either alcoholics or absent. One of the sons had already lost his father, and so they didn't have close relationships to their fathers. Their fathers, by and large, weren't emotionally accessible. Bruce Stedman, who was Mike's father, he had gone to Harvard. He had gotten sort of his first job after serving in World War II at the United Nations and had become this civil servant his whole life. It was only the sort of only job he had. At a certain point, he was stationed abroad, and he moved the family from East Williston, where he had raised his kids, to Africa for a few years, Eastern Africa. But yeah, I think that there was also this kind of generational component where, the 60s and 70s rolled around and these kids were kind of, going off the rails, and they were experimenting with drugs that their parents had never even heard about. And of course, alcohol was safe, but, marijuana and psychedelics were just a whole nother thing that they had no familiarity with, obviously. And it was the time of the Vietnam War and just this tremendous social upheaval. And so, Mike Stedman dropped out of college. He was upstate at Oneonta, moved out to the eastern end of Long Island to Montauk, and fell in with this very close-knit surfer crowd that by and large were connected by that. And they would be, plumbers and carpenters and fishermen by day and make a living that way. And, none of them aspired to have a corporate job or to have necessarily the stability of what that life looked like. And I think by and large, his father maybe never understood that. He wanted him to stand on his own 2 feet, but his father had gone to Harvard. He had just had a completely different life. And interesting, none of his 4 sons actually really would follow in his footsteps, which is what it is.
Yeah.
But one of my readers reached out a few months ago and was saying that the tragedy in the story would have been if Mike Stedman and Dave Connick had died in an office tower and they were working as accountants or lawyers, or that they had given up on their dream of what they wanted their lives to look like, and that there was real courage in doing what they did, that there was danger involved and uncertainty, of course, but that they were willing to sort of go against what their fathers might have wanted for them and to seek out a different version of their lives that would ultimately make them happier.
Right. You
Yeah.
wrote about Bruce, Mike's father, just wanting his sons to be happy, no matter what they did, right? To work hard and to be happy. And then there's a scene where Bruce is visiting Mike and Mary and the family, and he says, I don't want to give the whole book away, but
No, it's
says
fine.
something to his son that could seem so subtle. It was a subtle comment about his occupation that I could just imagine my father saying something like that to me, and he would say that things like that to me. I was only 16 and younger, and it seems benign, but something like that could really hurt a child and look for that parent's love for the rest of their lives, whether they're alive or dead, that parent.
It's so
So I won't.
true. There's like these little tiny little digs, right?
Mhm.
And they have such power. And I think they get lodged in our memory banks in different ways. And I think there was a deep sense, both for Mary, certainly, that there was this underlying disapproval of the life he had chosen, his wife that he had married. What he wanted him to be able to support himself, but this certainly wasn't the version of what he had hoped that would look like.
Right.
Um, yeah, and
Can,
then of
can we?
course we find out that his father, was kind of preaching one thing and then had his own thing going on the side. And obviously he never shared that with his sons
Right.
when they were living, but there's this cognitive dissonance there that I think on some subconscious level his sons had to have been picking up on, because
Absolutely.
kids just pick up on everything.
Absolutely. Sometimes it's subtle like that, and sometimes it's not. My father used to say, "I'll kill you if you smoke, do drugs, drink," and he did all those things in front of me. But there was a disconnection. But there's something going on there, like you said, and
Yeah. Do what I say, but not what I do. Or yeah.
yeah, they mean
Yeah.
well. They really. That's
I
why I
think
have
they
empathy.
do. I think they
They,
do. I think they're
yeah,
doing the best they can. It's not like they had the modeling of like a very connected, emotionally accessible parent. Right? This is all a very modern contrivance, right?
yeah,
And even psychology. And so I don't think there was any animus there. I don't think there was this intent to say those comments and have this deep woundedness afterward, right?
right,
I think there was actually really good intention behind it, wanting your child to be safe and secure and okay.
yeah,
But you're
yeah.
right; those things can be taken a whole number of ways.
Absolutely. I'm glad you brought that up. So that leads me to David and his mother, Alice. Tell us about that.
Mm.
She said something like that, like she just wanted her son to do something, that was different. I forget the words that you used, but tell us about them and their relationship.
Yeah, so Alice was this sort of gorgeous Jackie O character. I think she never had an ounce of fat on her body. She played competitive tennis. She was at the Maidstone Club, all summer long, having sort of endless cocktail parties and kind of a fabulous life of fancy ball gowns and what have you. And I think at the heart of it, she had, at least in what she shared with me, a fairly unhappy marriage. Both of them drank a lot. There was a lot of infidelity, and I think a deep sense of real unhappiness. And I think Dave was their one older son Pete sort of fit the, he was blonde and he was an athlete and he did sort of all of the socially acceptable things. And then Dave was always this kind of outlier. And early on he'd listened to Bob Marley and the Rolling Stones, and there was just this kind of cool factor. And he started skateboarding, and then he was downhill skiing, and just constantly kind of this adrenaline junkie. Then, of course, he started surfing and would fall in with this kind of stoner hippie crowd out east, and this whole kind of generation that was trying to find their way through. Not dissimilar to Mike Stedman, but Mike Stedman really became kind of a father figure to him, in a way that I think he never found a kind of camaraderie with his own dad. But I think Alice went to her grave. I had the fortune of sitting with her about a year and a half before she passed away, of just feeling like, God damn it, why didn't we get our son off that boat? This was such an avoidable tragedy. Why didn't his father intervene? Why didn't
Right.
I say something more? Why did we let him do this? It was so clear that this wasn't going to end well. And just a real, a deep regret and such a sadness. She was such a devout Catholic, and despite all of her faith and all of this time that had gone by, we're talking about almost 40 years.
Right.
It was so moving to sit with her. She had had fairly late stage Parkinson's, and she just
Yeah.
recalled everything like it had happened yesterday.
Yeah.
And it was
That
very, very
scene,
moving. Yeah. Sitting with her.
it was moving to read that scene in her beautiful home in East Hampton. And, some of us might look into that home and say, my God, you've got it all. Wonderful.
Exactly.
What a wonderful life. The country club, the cars, the beautiful home, the home in Manhattan. And here's this woman, this poor woman that had so much tragedy. Tell us a little bit about her family and what she endured with her brother and sister.
So yes, I think she had kind of casual, we were talking, I said, well, tell me a little bit about, what your family life was like. Her mother would die in childbirth, and then her father remarried, and both of her siblings went on to have just grave mental illness. Her sister, I believe, had bipolar disorder. Her brother committed suicide, although at the time, I think no one really spoke of things in such terms. But I spoke in quite a bit of length with her nephew, who was the son of the woman who had bipolar disorder, and just how difficult it was trying. So Alice was sort of this port in the storm, but the port was very unstable, and she also, just way before any of this would happen, had undergone so much tragedy. I mean, I feel like those two things alone would be enough for a lifetime, and then she loses her son at sea. And all those things taken together, I just, as a mother myself, I don't know how you go on after that. And, as a father, I mean, it's an inconceivable loss to have your child pass away before you do.
Yeah. And that reminds me that,
but you're right. There's this facade, like this person has everything, right? They have all these resources, and everything's so beautiful. And there's all these caretakers doing everything, making it all look so beautiful. And just how not that none of that matters, but that not all of the money in the world doesn't necessarily heal your heart at the end of the day.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I was just thinking about what Mike's mother said to Mary after Mike passed, her son, about grieving. The only grief is for a child, right?
Right.
It's not for a spouse, which again is so revealing, a comment like that.
Right. Poor and Mary, it's like, are you kidding me? They'd been in, this incredible love affair for 10 years, the love of her life. Yeah.
Okay, so I want to get to Chris.
You're such a close reader. I can't believe what a close reader you are.
Some of the people who interview
me haven't even read my book.
Really?
I swear to God. We can talk about that offline at some point, but yeah.
Sure, I'd love to. I'm telling you, this book resonated with me, and I would love to see authors getting into this, not to dig up the garbage in the past and the whatever's behind the closed doors, but to show us that we're more alike than different. That's what when I read this, you got two families with high pedigrees, more money than God. Then you got two families that are just local, living off the land, doing God's work, and they both have similar experiences.
Right.
Psychologically,
we're all
emotionally.
Equal. Yeah.
Yeah. So when I walked away from your book, and I walked away from your book with hope because of this last chapter that I've been teasing my audience with about Chris. Now you go to Hawaii where Chris lives, and you meet this guy who looks like who?
Just like Michael Stedman.
Yeah. Just like
I
the father.
just I had chills up my arm when I first saw Chris. It looks identical to his father. The hair, the teeth, the kind of posture of his body. And again, this was, we sat down together in Kauai where the brothers all lived. And, it was me kind of introducing myself, us early talking about the secret that he had revealed to me on the phone. But then it really wasn't until, we would have these long phone conversations over the next year and a half that he, that again, part of the chapter is about how my arrival sort of then kind of re-triggered his trauma, and then it sort of made him go into a different kind of therapy, as you know, called EMDR, which is this rapid movement therapy that can help. It doesn't erase the trauma, but it makes it feel less traumatic, hopefully, with a great practitioner. And so he had done that work, and, he would have these intense dreams of his father. And what's interesting when you talk to people about traumatic events is you either have blocked all of it out, or you remember kind of every single detail. And then oftentimes when you start recalling it, you start recalling more details. And then your memory is quite sneaky in that it rewires your memory, given that if you just keep recalling the same story, the memory sort of shifts in time as well. So he had a whole bunch of different revelations that would reveal themselves over time.
Yeah.
But yeah.
I want to comment on EMDR. It's a therapy that my therapist used with me, and it took me back to those moments with my father and helped me reframe them and look at them for what they were. Instead of I'm this bad little kid, I'm just a kid with this adult who's struggling, clearly struggling, and putting onto me the challenges that he has. And the EMDR, for my audience, if you have a therapist and you have the opportunity to do it, it's incredibly beneficial, because you get a different perspective of the trauma that you may or may not know that you're walking around with for decades, for lifetimes. And it had helped me to see my father for who he was, and to have empathy for that suffering person, a family member whom I loved, first person that I loved in my life besides my mother. Very, very powerful. And I'm so glad when you added that, I was like, wow, she's done her homework. This is good. So thanks for that.
Yeah, thank you. I just, one caveat is you're saying, it's like any some therapists are better than others, right? Everyone's different, the work that we do. But I think I've also heard from readers that didn't do that with an experienced person and then had a re-traumatizing effect. So I think it's just really worth doing your homework for anyone listening that's curious about that, to just maybe get a recommendation from someone that's actually done that with them, or another physician, or someone that can guide you, rather than just sort of going online and booking an appointment with your nearest EMDR person.
Thanks.
Just a little bit of a cautionary tale there, it's just really serious, deep work.
Yeah. And thanks for that. Right. It's gotta be someone who's qualified, and that, like therapists, like anyone else, there's better ones, and there's ones that you
resonate with and don't. And of course.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I want to leave us with the scene that I just think about Chris, the son of Mike, captain lost at sea, and he's doing this therapy work, and he ends up, and I don't want to give it away, but I just want to say this one part. You still have to read the book, guys. Have to read the book, because there's so much we didn't talk about, Amanda, about him being in that wheelhouse with his father. That was powerful.
It is powerful. And one little tidbit that's not in the book that Chris shared with me a bit ago was, and I had mentioned it earlier, as this is a perfect way to sort of end and do this full circle, is that, in looking at the life of his father now as a father himself, and he's in his late 40s, and he's just a completely different person than he was at 9 years old. He wonders if some of the bad decision making that, say, his father was making around the purchase of this boat and the storm that he stayed out in for too long, which is something he normally wouldn't do, was on some level a subconscious way of realizing his life was sort of spiraling out of control, that his marriage wasn't what it looked like, and that he just had lost control of that. And it's just an interesting way of thinking about that. Obviously, we'll never know what the truth of that story is and what his father was thinking in the last minutes and seconds of his life. But it's an interesting interpretation. I think it's something that felt true to me.
It is.
Yeah.
Amanda, thank you so much for taking this time to share this story with us, for writing this book, and also digging a little bit deeper and helping us in the process.
Thank you, Peter. I so appreciate your sensitivity and your vulnerability, and it's all of your wonderful questions. So thank you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. And to you, until next time, I'm Peter.
Until next time.
Right.